71% of Canadian consumers say they intend to buy fewer American products this year.
Canada is a very tough country to deal with.
It's got some staying power. When Trump calls us the 51st state as a deliberate insult, it is amplified on social media. And so he's actually keeping it top of mind. He's keeping the boycott going.
It began with a remark that shook Canadians. In February, President Trump triggered a trade war and suggested Canada might be America's 51st state. What could have been dismissed as political theater struck a nerve. By spring, surveys showed 71% of Canadians plan to reduce purchases of American goods in 2025. Economists cited by CNBC warned the boycott could slice 0.3% from U.S. GDP this year, about $90 billion in lost output. Walking into grocery stores in Ontario or Quebec, the shift is plain to see. Where displays once overflowed with U.S. corn and berries, shelves now carry Canadian flags and Made in Canada labels. What began as consumer frustration has turned into a movement of economic nationalism. The message is simple. If there is a Canadian choice, that is the choice people will make.
The pressure is most obvious in food and drink. At Vince's Market, a Toronto-based chain serving 30,000 weekly customers, managers said that during Canada's off-season, they once relied on American produce for up to 70% of their stock. Today, that share has dropped to about 30%. Apps like MapleScan help shoppers verify origin and encourage them to favor local substitutes. Losses are clear in agriculture and beverages. Canada was the United States' second-largest food export market in 2024, worth $28.4 billion. California wines once filled 30 to 40% of red wine sales in Canadian shops. That revenue, about $60,000 a week for some stores, has evaporated. Provinces imposed a 25% tariff on U.S. alcohol this March, and bottles vanished from shelves. Imports of distilled spirits from the U.S., valued at $221 million in 2024, are being replaced by supplies from France, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. American farmers and vintners who depended on cross-border sales are watching demand collapse.
The boycott is not confined to products. Travel has become another front. In 2024, 20 million Canadians visited the United States and spent $20.5 billion. This year, the flow is shrinking rapidly. Online searches for U.S. trips from Canada dropped 50% in the spring. Land crossings in March were down almost 30% year-over-year, while air travel fell 22% in June, according to CBC. For border economies, this is a crisis. Restaurants, retail outlets, and hotels in Windsor and Detroit, or Buffalo and New York State, report vanishing traffic. The U.S. Travel Association estimated America is on track to lose $12.5 billion in international visitor spending in 2025 compared with last year. Local businesses describe empty parking lots and declining revenues with no clear path to recovery.
The White House insists tariffs are making America stronger, yet for U.S. companies watching their Canadian sales disappear, the picture looks very different. While Japan and the European Union have signed new tariff frameworks and South Korea remains in talks, Canada is drifting further away. Instead of cooling tensions, Trump's rhetoric often reignites them. By repeating provocative statements and doubling down on trade barriers, he has helped keep the boycott alive. The result is a cycle of loss. American producers are squeezed, border towns are weakened, and international travelers are looking elsewhere. Even in Europe, early signs show consumers turning away from U.S. brands, suggesting the damage is not limited to North America. For Canadians, the Buy Canadian movement has become a unifying act of resistance. For Americans, it is a warning that tariffs and insults can cost dearly in jobs, sales, and reputation. Trump promised to put America first. The irony is that his approach has left America losing ground in its closest and most reliable market. The boycott that started in Canada is proving durable, and the costs are mounting day by day.
I'm disappointed that I came to Canada, a Canada that it is very, very difficult to find Canadians who are passionate about the American-Canadian relationship. Elbows up, me too. It was an anti-American campaign.
At the start of 2025, President Trump launched his second term with an aggressive trade agenda. The White House imposed reciprocal tariffs ranging from 10 to 50% on key sectors, including steel, aluminum, copper, and even automobiles. Canada, America's closest trading partner, was hit immediately. Exports slowed, supply chains shifted, and the political climate turned tense. Yet when U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra arrived in Halifax, he told the Chamber of Commerce that this was not a trade war.
The cabinet's now saying that we're at war with America. That doesn't help, okay? Maybe in Canada saying we're at war, maybe that's something that Canadians stand up and say, yes, 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 okay? We have an enemy. I don't think so.
He accused Canada of exaggerating, of playing hardball, and of branding the United States as an enemy. The paradox is clear. Washington fired the first shot with tariffs, but now claims that Canada is overreacting. What the ambassador called negotiation, many Canadians experienced as direct economic pressure on jobs and communities.
We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada. I think Canada could be one where they'll just pay tariffs.
Don't push a Canadian too far. I mean, push too far. Push too far.
Prime Minister Mark Carney framed the situation differently. For him, the phrase "elbows up" was not an anti-American slogan, but a way of telling Canadians to protect themselves when pushed around. That message resonated across the country. Families cut back on trips to the United States. According to Statistics Canada data for August, cross-border travel by car dropped 35%, while air travel to U.S. cities fell 25% year over year. Air Canada reduced flights south of the border and instead added 28 new international routes to Europe, the Caribbean, and South America. Consumers also adjusted their choices at home. Industry reports show American liquor sales in Canada plunged 62% in the latest quarter, forcing companies like Brown-Forman, the producer of Jack Daniels, to issue profit warnings. Loblaw, the country's largest grocery chain, removed dozens of U.S. items from shelves and replaced them with more than 100 Canadian suppliers. Even culture shifted. Indigo reported that sales of Canadian-authored books rose 25% year over year, while CBC Gem streaming surged 34%, lifting programs like Murdoch Mysteries and Heartland. These are not just slogans, they are real changes in daily life.
The numbers tell an even bigger story. Canadian exports to the United States declined 2% this year, equal to roughly $5 billion Canadian dollars. That is a real loss. But exporters quickly looked elsewhere. Shipments to the United Kingdom jumped 63% in value, and sales to Europe rose 26%. In fact, the United Kingdom has now displaced China to become Canada's second largest trading partner. That shift demonstrates how pressure from tariffs has accelerated diversification. While Washington expected Ottawa to soften its position, Canadian companies found new buyers and new routes. The boomerang effect is hitting U.S. businesses hard. Alcohol producers have lost market share, and once Canadian shelves are restocked with local brands, that space is difficult to win back. What began as an attempt to squeeze Canada is instead eroding American commercial presence north of the border.
Ambassador Hoekstra urged Canadians to stop treating the United States as an adversary, but the direction is already changing. Prime Minister Carney traveled to Mexico this month to reinforce trade and energy cooperation. Ottawa is deepening links with Europe and the United Kingdom. Canadians are shifting how they travel, what they buy, and which markets they serve. The tariffs that were meant to reassert U.S. power have done the opposite. They have redefined the relationship, leaving Canada more self-reliant and less dependent on its neighbor. Trump wanted to prove that tariffs could force compliance. Instead, they are pushing Canada to stand taller, with Carney guiding a pivot that is reshaping trade, culture, and everyday choices. The backfire is no longer a prediction, it is the new reality of North American economics.
Interfor announced that from September to December, they will reduce lumber production in North America.
I think the frustrating thing is that so much faith has been put in the relationship between Canada and the U.S. over the last number of years, and to see your best friend turn on you and create an economic crisis to try to hurt you.
One of the largest forestry companies in North America has just pulled back in a way that sends shockwaves across the border. Interfor announced it will cut lumber production by 145 million board feet between September and December. That is about 12% of its usual output, and the slowdown stretches across mills from Sault Ste. Marie to Elk Lake in Ontario. On the surface, it looks like a corporate adjustment to weak demand, but beneath it lies a political story, because the cutback is unfolding at the same time that U.S. tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber have been ratcheted higher. What was intended as a way to pressure Canada is now creating uncertainty for American builders who depend on this supply every single day. Interfor has explained that it is facing persistently weak market conditions and broad economic uncertainty. In late July and August, the U.S. Department of Commerce finalized anti-dumping and countervailing duties on Canadian lumber, pushing combined rates to between 20 and 34%. For exporters, these costs cut margins and discourage full production. At the ground level, the effects are clear. In Sault Ste. Marie, a third of workers were put on rotating schedules, collecting employment insurance for several weeks, while senior employees kept steady shifts. Families now live with unpredictable paychecks, a direct consequence of trade decisions at the border. The intention behind the tariffs was clear. By imposing heavy duties, Washington hoped to push Canada toward concessions in trade talks. But the outcome is not lining up with the plan. When a company like Interfor reduces supply, the direct result is less Canadian lumber flowing into the United States. That matters because U.S. construction has long leaned on Canadian imports. Roughly 3/4 of the softwood lumber used for home building south of the border comes from Canada. Already, futures markets reacted to the September announcement. Prices that had been sliding due to oversupply began to move upward again. Builders now face the prospect of higher costs for framing, roofing, and flooring. This is not a theoretical problem. Housing affordability in the U.S. is already stretched, and construction budgets for infrastructure projects are tight. By forcing supply cuts, the tariff policy risks making these challenges worse. The notion of punishing Canada begins to look like self-inflicted pain. Interfor's move is more than a corporate decision. It is a sign of how an industry adapts when tariffs make cross-border trade less viable. Instead of bending to U.S. pressure, Canadian producers are trimming output and exploring other markets, while Ottawa has stepped in with more than $1 billion Canadian dollars in sector support. The outcome is that American builders have fewer options, not more. Union leaders in Ontario warned that if Washington extends tariffs beyond softwood lumber to products like pulp or oriented strand board, Canada will be forced to escalate its response. That would set off a new round of retaliatory measures and deepen the divide between two economies that have long depended on each other. The lesson is straightforward. Tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber were designed to secure leverage. What they are delivering instead is rising volatility, fewer jobs on both sides of the border, and higher prices in the United States. The backfire is already visible, and it raises a deeper question. How long can Washington continue a strategy that undermines its own housing market while straining a trade relationship that has been central to North American growth for decades?